Good evening. I can see a wonderful audience coming in, gathering. We're delighted to welcome all of you to this webinar on ways of seeing. I'll just give it one more moment before we start so that more people can join in. I can see numbers are growing even as I appear on your screen. So just give it another moment and we'll have a lovely discussion that I hope will prove extremely enjoyable for everyone concerned, both everyone on the panel as well as those in the audience. Good evening, everyone. Can I begin by asking my panelists to put on their videos and come on? They can remain muted for now till I do introductions and get the start part over with. There you are, Rekha, Tasneem, and waiting for Saloni. There you are. Thank you all for joining in. I'm so delighted to be hosting this conversation this evening around the whole concept of a gaze, male gaze, whether it's all of it around this together called Ways of Seeing, where we've looked at the body of women artists as well as male artists who've created artworks around women as a muse. And this, I think, has allowed us the opportunity of creating this conversation. DAG, of course, has a history of hosting some compelling exhibitions, and we're lucky to be associated as curators, as writers, and as researchers, able to dig into its inventory and pull out some fantastic works and share them with the people, with art lovers, but of course with the people of this country as well, and especially now with an online viewing room, as many people as possible can come online and view our exhibitions. So to kickstart this conversation, I'm going to say, does art have a gender? Does literature or cinema? All these certainly have a perspective, and that perspective might be female. Sorry, if in case I went off for a little bit. Wanting to build an exhibition around women in art, it was hard to avoid John Berger's Ways of Seeing, a book and BBC series that literally set the cat among the pigeons, provoking us into thinking about the concept of a male gaze linked to the creation and patronage of art. In India, we are only too aware of the romanticization, but also iconicization of women in art as objects of desire or of sacred reverence. Literally, the whore and the saint. But what are the women in the paintings? Do they have agency over themselves, their minds, their bodies, or are they mere props to the male gaze? It was this that we set out to explore in the exhibition, splitting it into two halves, women artists and the magnificent diversity of their range. Truly, truly amazing diversity. And men artists with women as their muse. It is deliberately provocative, this skewed view, but it opens up the subject for necessary conversations. Was Amrita Shergill's gaze male, or did she take ownership of the female body? Are Anupam Sood's realistic portrayals of the body subversive? What about Gogi Saroj Pal or Vasundhara Tiwari Bruta and their portrayal of the unclothed body as a reflection of our society? And Hussein's troubled legacy, even subject rather than the gaze? Or Souza's confrontationist nudes, which allow his subjects a power that might well negate the concept of a... And more as we engage lists. Thank you, audience, for joining in, and do post your questions for our panelists to take up at the end of the conversation. Allow me now to present our eminent panel as they prepare to remarks. Zakaria Mehta, without whom Bombay would not be the same. Do I can anticipate her imploring me already to refer to her city as Mumbai and not Bombay, where she has the Bhau Daji Museum, formerly the Victoria and Albert Museum, as managing trustee and honorary director. An alumnus of Sir J.J. School of Art, an art historian and curator, Tasneem oversaw the radical conservation effort at the museum that has made it so special for all of us and has opened up spaces for hosting independent exhibitions, making Bhau Daji one of the cherished cultural spaces in her opening remarks. Tasneem, if you could unmute. You still need to unmute Tasneem. You'll have an icon on your left bottom corner. If you'd like someone to get in touch with you, should I? No. There you are.
Thank you. Just my screen.
Wonderful to have you here.
Because I've done so many of these, I do know the technical, just a little bit of the technical stuff. So yes, good evening, everybody, and thank you, Kishore, for inviting me to be part of this discussion. So my comments is really that, you know, I hesitate to create binaries of this kind. I think there are each situation in each context, each artist deserves her or his own special gaze or interpretation. But and of course, each historic period, and a lot of the works in your exhibition belong to a certain historic period. And I think today what has happened is the woman has grabbed, the female artist has grabbed the male gaze and to some extent reversed it, but not reversed it in quite the same derogatory or depredating way. I think women have just, you know, been able to empower themselves and talk about so many ways in which they were subjugated, and art has been, and as Rekha's work, wonderful work, some of Rekha's wonderful work has, you know, used the female body and used tropes that say stitching and other kinds of work processes that are particularly female. So to that extent, I think that it's true, but I do think that to some extent we have also moved on. And I also think that you can't say, I'm not sure you can gender a work of art per se. You can read into it. It's such a personal interaction that one has with the work of art. And so I understand where you're coming from. When you historicize it in this way, it is important to speak about certain issues. But I also have problems in drawing up binaries and saying women artists do this and male artists do it this way. I can talk a little bit about this later with regard to an exhibition that we had, Connecting Threads, where we talked quite deeply about this issue, Pooja Vash and myself. Pooja was my curator at the museum. She's now, of course, moved on to the JNAF. And we discussed this in quite a lot of depth. And so I'm happy to come back to the subject and talk about how we thought about it then and how it played out in our exhibition. Thank you. Yeah, could you hear me?
We could hear that. Yes, thank you, Tasneem. And I agree. I couldn't agree more on the binaries and the way, you know, one can't really create silos around those binaries. We will come back to all of this as we take the conversation forward. Meanwhile, I'm next my utterly friend Rekha Rodwittiya. It also makes me glad that she's chosen art as her profession, else she would have given us writers around money and how. Rekha is an alumnus of the Faculty of Fine Arts, Baroda, and the Royal College of Art, London. This scopic quality, and one of the finest of those is on view currently at the refurbished Peabody Essex Museum. Thank you for sharing that. Fellow of the Asian Cultural Council Rockefeller Fellowship. She's unapologetically feminist in her approach to both her life and her work, and I'm looking forward to what she has to say. Over to you, Rekha.
Thank you, Kishore. So as you had said in your communication that I have 6 minutes, so I have something prepared for the 6 minutes. To have any insightful communication on addressing how gender bias influences perception, and in particular the gaze of an individual, we would need, in my opinion, for the forum to contextualize how we view the ideals of freedom, equality, and liberty for all within the framework of existing political consciousness and the prevailing cultural traditions of our society, where patriarchal practices and caste divides are the broadly accepted norm that govern our country. Though this may appear to be a wide sweep of the brush or considered too overreaching a premise from where to begin a discourse, I am emphatic that it is the condition of human experience within everyday living, where notions of patriarchal entitlement leave its residue in every crevice of life in India. Therefore, in a nutshell, it would be completely within reason for me to say that in India, we have a prevailing mindset that negates the exemplification of gender equality as being the considered logical and appropriate choice to make within our presiding attitudes that should determine our actions both within the public and private domain. Instead, we have misogynistic behavior everywhere, with rape and heinous atrocities targeting women in horrifying displays of male entitlement that too often go unpunished. In relation to our conversation on the gaze in art today, it would have to be acknowledged that generations of art history reveal the female figure as a sexual object of desire, one to offer pleasure and to delight the voyeuristic gaze. Let us also not forget the omission of chronicling the practice of female artists over the centuries, thereby suggesting through this omission that the perceptions of women somehow appear not to have merited attention. It becomes imperative, therefore, for us to be alert to the lessons within history if we desire not to perpetuate such unwarranted gender bias. Which brings me to the area of ways of seeing, and the question it poses that inquires of us whether there is such a thing as a different perception that differentiates how differing genders perceive. Without doubt, all genders offer responses via their experience within the dominant prevailing social construct that they live in or place themselves in within. Added to this are the personal experiences encountered that equally define the politics of response in how communication is put forth or received. The gaze, therefore, is a communication that holds one's politics and reflects a location of position of attitude, both personal and societal. However, it is here where I must interject the clarification that a feminist position is one that comprehends the issue of sexism and must not be confused merely as a position of belonging that is for women alone. Therefore, if we are to discourse about the gazer, the gaze and the space in between, and whether art has a gender, I think that it must be recognized that though there is a large differential between the way female and males perceive, it must be also considered that there are individuals who have consciously been nurtured or have been informed themselves and therefore have an altered gaze. Which leads me to position whether I believe that art can hold the ability to provoke responses and reflection in a public domain. I emphatically believe that. I have always viewed art to be a tool that facilitates my interpolation with an outside world and where my politics can find its resonance. I recognize that mature art holds radical positions that are most definitely impactful and where the potential to strategize arguments, problematize as a method of introspection, confront and be used as a subversive tool, all can occur. As a feminist, it is the oral histories that recount for me some of the most powerful narratives of valor and are often the stories of survival of those most vulnerable and dispossessed. It is these legacies of human triumph that inspire me as an artist to place my energies to conjoin with these ancestries of determination and courage. Therefore, it would suggest by default that my perception to everything that I view, and therefore all that I articulate, is pronounced from the position of feminist intent. In stating this, I'm attempting to suggest that it is the conditioning you receive or what you choose to imbibe that will most definitely shape your viewing and your way of viewing the world. I live and breathe through the experiences of being a woman, and my art is articulated from these experiences and the geography of my belonging. The territory that I address as an artist is located within the resistance that spirited and courageous women uphold, that articulates lessons of empowered female identity. The many stories of fortitude of ordinary and often anonymous women of both rural and urban spaces that have championed women's rights in the face of overbearing and debilitating patriarchy leads us to be obliged to acknowledge that perceptions are most definitely different for women. If one is to look at the art made by women, we would recognize that it is often a receptacle of new meanings produced from their experiences observed, researched, or lived, making their art a bridge that allows the viewer to discover new ways of seeing outside of the familiar, inviting for altered perceptions to take shape. What I will finally say in the segment of time allotted to me is that perceptions are conditioned responses and get altered through interventions and learning that provide the options of the alternative. Thank you.
Rekha, thank you so much. That was emphatically put, and I couldn't agree more with you on many of the things that you've shared and stated. It's also a wonderful summation of what we're going to be discussing and talking about. Saloni Doshi is a recent cyber acquaintance whose fame well precedes her. She's both a collector and mentor to artists, has strong views on the kind of art she herself with, is the founder of 118 in Mumbai. And much to my amazement, I learned that she had to study John Berger's ways of seeing as part of her course. Makes her Saloni. Saloni says she hadn't thought of art from a do seem to have a bias geared towards the male form. She has to say about all this. Over to you, Saloni. You'll have to unmute.
Thank you, Kishore, for that unique introduction. I found it very interesting when I got this invitation to speak on this subject, because I actually haven't touched on this topic, even with my friends or colleagues in the art world, since I studied art last at the LSE, where I actually studied gender in the media. And, we studied objectification of women and all of that, and how to look at an image, and what is the male gaze, and, John Berger's text, as well as many others. But I feel like, in context of today's times and the generation, that is currently producing what we call contemporary art, vis-a-vis modern art, I think the socio-political transformation that has happened, art is no longer, gender is no longer, I think for me, gender is no longer male or female. It is more LGBTQIA+. So I feel we have moved on from, the male and the female gaze to, many other genders that do exist, and our consciousness of that. That's one. Second is, in terms of patronage of art, I feel the world that I have entered into, I have seen many more female gallerists, female collectors, female and female artists. Because if you look at art pre-independence, it was patronage predominantly, or rather only male. It's post-independence that, the women...
Sitting on the trio.
Sorry, can you hear me? So
yep.
It's only, after independence that, the female voice started coming, in terms of, patronage, in terms of, just being an artist, or in terms of anything at all, that it started coming into being. And today's generation is enjoying the luxuries of many modern artists, as well as artists like Rekha, Anju, many who actually fought the battles already for us to have it very easy. I look at today's art no longer being about the gaze. It's about, the world we are living in, which is more about conflict, wars, socio-political crimes, urbanization, and all of that. So I just feel like, I think, and of course the LGBTQ community and gender issues in that sense. So I think it's more inclusion of gender vis-a-vis male versus female as a debate for me personally.
Thank you, Saloni. That was and very, very clear. I'm going to kick off, get right into. There are some bandwidth issues at my end, so if my voice is a little fractured, feel free to ask again. Women watch themselves being looked at, creating a cycle of the gazer and the gazed, something that Jean-Paul Sartre first mentioned, and leading to this whole notion of scopophilia, which is pleasure one has in being a part of this universe of the gazed. So to kick off the discussion about the whole notion of pleasure and pain and association with voyeurism and the role men and women as a I'm going to start with you, Rekha. We've seen the validity as an art historical figure, the subject of art for several centuries in the past, with many changes last. But artists also looked at the female form, the female figure. How do you reconcile the notion of these two?
Okay, Kishore.
With the fact that you present the body also fairly boldly, with a point of view that is, as you mentioned, fairly emphatic. Where does your art practice look at something like this?
Kishore, it's very difficult to hear your commentary, so everything is coming out very fractured. So let me try not to waste time, and let me hope that I'm actually addressing your question. I want to just say one thing. I completely agree that today gender is not really something that you can place so conveniently as male and female, and that's why I use the word genders in a plural. And so I would definitely take Saloni's point on, because I think that's absolutely relevant. I just want to add something, because I'm really not certain in the exact precise question you have posed to me. But I do want to say that, there is, India cannot pretend, and for me, art is so interwoven with the geographies of where you live and the conditioning of social and cultural practices. There is no way that anybody can tell me that art is sort of separated from that, unless somebody has a mental illness and is delinked from everyday living. Money can also isolate you and allow you to not have to address some of the more basic issues that are there and prevalent. So I have to say that till such time as we have a political intervention that addresses these issues, like perhaps Australia has attempted to do, we are going to find that those who are the marginal, and so therefore, unfortunately, this is not a position that I would like to say I stand and I speak for, but the manner in which the representation of the voice of the woman is never really included in anything of significance. So when for example, Saloni talks about, and I completely agree with her, that yes, of course, we have wonderful examples of women in galleries and in museums, but you must understand that the policy making space and the power of money still is controlled very much by men. And so it's not that I am doing away with the fact that there is wonderful interventions by women, but it is such an uphill task. So how does that impact me as a painter? You see, I'm somebody who uses the space of history, not necessarily only from a referential space. And this is very important, I think, for me to note, that I look at history to be able to understand my location within it. And so given the fact that I do belong to a certain elitist space within my own country, it obliges me in many ways to be far more critical and discerning of the manner in which I present the argument, whatever that argument may be. And it happens to be one which is, takes in the politics of gender. I think, for example, I would like to, because as I said, I really don't know what your question was, but I would like to at this point say that, I did really appreciate the kind of curatorial intent of the last Kochi Biennale, where the ideas of how you looked at gender were certainly examined, But if I have to come back to the DAG show and very quickly, hand the floor back to all of you, I think that it is a massive landscape within which one is trying to address, issues that are in fact quite far-reaching. Is it simple enough to place male and female in counterposition with one another? Perhaps not. But that in no way is against the feminist position that I'm taking. I think that the discourse is more complex than that. I think that we would have to, in the case of India, take in class and caste, for example. There is no way you can read the ideas of gender without taking into account these factors. So the manner in which we view patriarchy, or how we are looking at what happens within art, let us just take that assumption, and I'll very quickly end here. Let us just make this sort of silly assumption, because it is a silly assumption, that we are all far more refined and cultured because we are in these rarefied spaces of art, which is really not a fact. The conditioning that you bring with you, the education that you bring with you from your womb, from the time you've been in the womb, is something that patinas the manner in which you live. So you have to actually create a conscious rupture, either that is created for you by your family, by your institution, or by your own endeavor, or by some horrendous, tragic circumstance. Because this is something, that somebody asked me, that why is it considered that experience that is traumatic is one that you learn much more from. Unfortunately, that's a fact. And so unless, somebody has gone through the horrors of something that forces you to oblige, that what you have been taking for granted as a given needs to be readdressed, I think many times, and history is showing this to us, we are sort of waltzing through this idea that gender differences don't matter and that it doesn't impact us. Of course it does.
Of course it does. It's where I would ask Tasneem, you have this background in art history, Tasneem, you've curated many exhibitions and you wanted to talk about one of them as well, but also in the context of your heading in a museum, and in museums, so many discussions now are kind of circulating around history, geography, and a certain portrayal. Does gender become a part of that discourse within a museum space as well?
So I would just like to say that, I agree with both what Rekha and what Saloni have said, but if we look at the idea of the gaze and look at the idea of the audience gaze, when we have an audience, which is very different from what Rekha just said, all of us who are cognoscenti, who are elite and educated, and the kind of audience that comes to the museum, and what kind of gaze do they come with? So I have to tell you that it's very interesting, because we also come to view those audiences with certain presuppositions and prejudices, and they actually come with a desire to know and to learn and to perhaps dismantle some of what they know. So they are very, very receptive. Whether it necessarily breaks down certain, patriarchal attitudes which are so ingrained, I just feel that, especially in a city like in the urban space, so we are talking about urban spaces. We are talking about exhibitions and people view. Within the urban space, I think it is different, okay? And so I think there definitely is a, it's less gendered in that sense. So we often have, for example, you know, people who come with wearing, say, I don't want to get into any descriptions of religion, but they're wearing traditional clothes, let's say. And they're both viewing sometimes these very provocative exhibitions that we have, and the man is explaining to the woman. So, I feel we have moved on. I think a lot of what your exhibition is talking about and how you have historicized it is very correct. That there was this gaze, the 19th century, it was, and women reacted to it. You have the Gorilla Girls, you had, which at the Kochi Biennale, and you had the response, you have the response even from Indian female artists. But exactly as Saloni has said, I think today's young artists actually don't want to be defined in a gendered way, or if they do inscribe it into their art, they're doing it very consciously to give it a certain agency. And in terms of talking about, say, for example, the exhibition that we had, that Pooja Vesh and I curated together, Connecting Threads, which was looking at textile traditions in India and looking how artists had employed, the process of making also. Um, we found, of course, that tended to be much more the process of stitching, the process of working with the hand, tended to be much more a female preoccupation. And then we wanted to work, so initially we were going to keep it just about the women artists, and we felt that those binaries actually are breaking down, and then we explored more. And we found, there were male artists who were working with fabric and working with it in a completely, with a different sensibility. Now, could some of those works that were made by the male artists have been made by the female artists? Yes, I think so. I think that the kind of incredible work that, say, a Dozen Lazaro does that we had, or a Manish Nai, or Shahzad Dawood, the three male artists, that could also have been addressed by the kind of work they do. So I think those very sort of defined binaries in that abstract space, it was, slightly more abstract space, are breaking down. And as I said, I think that when women artists use that sense of gender, and they're doing it consciously, they're doing it to bring a certain agency to the work. And I think also it's very important, what Rekha said, to understand the kind of political landscape within which we function, and therefore it's very important that we do have these kind of discussions to see how I think what we should be discussing also is how far have we gone in terms of breaking down these binaries. Do we need to do more as looking at the social landscape, rather than just art historicizing it, because the art historicizing is sort of known. We need to sort of share with each other perhaps some ways in which we see how we could go forward in terms of giving greater agency, and to make this discussion sort of more fruitful in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have another parallel conversation about how male and female artists create works around current situations. For example, where we look at things like borders and geography and war and violence, and certainly you see a certain difference in their approaches and in their handling of relationships and certain sensitivities that are involved. But that, as I said, becomes a parallel kind of conversation to this. But what you raised was a very interesting point, Tasneem, about this whole, how these have been notational forms embedded within art history. but we're also people who consume art history, read it, learn from it, and of course, take our own courses out of it. But in fact, does it impact us, art history, and the way we look at art? Because there's a certain conditioning that is involved with it. And I think, Saloni, it would be interesting for you to tell us, for example, do positions differently from men, at least, or do women collectors collect differently from male collectors, or art collection, for example, do you bring a certain eye or a certain gaze that might be different from what we've been seeing elsewhere?
I can only speak for myself. I know a whole
Absolutely,
range of
yes.
collectors, who've been collecting modern, some are collecting old, and a lot of people my age are collecting contemporary. So I can only speak for myself. But when, again, when this mail came to me, and I thought of it in terms of my own collection and my own gaze, let alone someone else's, as an informed audience, like Rekha mentioned, that we do come from a certain space. So, as an I realize I've barely bought a work which only has a single female figure. All my works, pretty much most of them, which is about 90% of my collection, has the male figure very prominent in it, including in my house. So I mean, I actually had to go through it, and I was quite shocked, because actually it's this talk that made me realize that maybe I don't look at art the way it was looked at before. Maybe I seek different things in what I want to. So even if there is a work of Pushpamala, for example, of Vasco da Gama's arrival to India, Pushpamala as the main protagonist is dressed as Vasco da Gama. If it's Tejal Shah in a Hijra series, work of hers, she's dressed as the male. And these are the kind of works I do have in my collection. And I just felt that yeah, I mean, as Tasneem said, that you cannot historicize this. At the same time, I think we have just moved on to looking at art in different ways. I don't know what my gaze would be called. Is it voyeuristic or is it not? I mean, I don't see like someone, I mean, I would just put it this way. If somebody asked me, would you want an image of a Devi and an image of Michelangelo's David? I would have Michelangelo's David as a sculpture in my house. So that's what I mean. I don't look at it in, I look at it very differently. And I see that this is the way I have consumed imagery of art as well in my personal collection. So, yeah.
Okay, also requesting the audience, do keep posting your questions that we will take towards the end of this conversation. If you can hear me now, Rekha, what I was trying to figure out when I was posing a question to you was to try and understand the inheritance of the form, and in particular, female inherited from artists. And we've seen in our own artists, whether it's Amrita Shergill or Anjali Menon, or sorry, did you get that?
Inherited from, I lost the in between, sorry.
Well, the inheritance of the female figure, the female form that we've had art historically from painters who tended to be male, that has now moved through Amrita Shergill, Anjali Menon, yourself, there's Gogi Sarojpal, there's Vasundhara Tiwari, etc. How do you think the form has evolved? And is there an inherent difference in what these women artists, yourself included, are saying vis-a-vis what you're kind of emphasizing?
What vis-a-vis who? Vis-a-vis what?
Vis-a-vis your male artists, your male counterparts.
Your counterparts.
Okay, fine.
Yeah.
Well, to start off with, I would have to say that, the preoccupations of a female artist does not necessarily have to be one that is in the discovery of creating a counterposition. What I am trying to
I agree.
Okay, so what I'm really trying to say is that, and I slightly disagree with my friends on the panel, that historicizing is an extremely important and relevant thing. Whether something remains, on the top of the agenda of notice is not really what I'm talking about, but it is sort of understanding that certain things really require that we continue to sort of invest in seeing that it is guided to its, its appropriate direction. So in that sense, I would say that the idea of feminist intent in art, in policy making for art, in museum collections, all of that must remain as something that is palpably seen as relevant. But it doesn't need to be the only thing. So that's what I would like to say. Now, in relation to this, I remember very, and this is in no way trying to make some kind of a separation, but when a female artist, if I take somebody like Navjot, for example, her preoccupations with looking at how she places herself in imbibing and in understanding and negotiating the world. Okay, so there is, when she, whether it was from Marxist preoccupations to taking it to more sort of, lived phenomenons, or going to place herself in other locations. Now, here I would also like to say, and I will sort of answer you more pointedly, but I need to say this. I am somebody who really, holds great grief that we are talking, and we have talked since I'm 62 now, so the last 40 something years of being a damn artist. We only talk about the urban context. And why do we do that? This really bothers me, Look at the work of somebody like Ganga Devi, Why are we not even considering that? So when I'm saying that the female, and I think that Tasneem talked about it, the interpretations, So but then it also involves gaze. You follow my point? So when you see something, I don't think that, I would like to believe, let me not make this an absolute. I would like to believe that when a woman is being raped, we're not taking out a cell phone and videoing it. I think this is not going to be the possibility that a woman does. So I think that what I'm trying to say is that I don't want to separate art in this sort of more cliched way of saying that, we have moved on. Our preoccupations in how we deal with making art is within the concurrentness of the reality of who we are. What is our politics? What is our economics? What is the state of, is it pluralism or lack of pluralism? All this. And so when we look at a work of art, it doesn't necessarily have to be descriptive of that particular intent, but it can have the subtext to it. So now, to try to answer your question, for me, of course, I mean, I think that, theory and art history and the visual has been something that has been my cradle, that allowed me to find the rhythm of my own sort of plumb line. And then one then found the empathy that you placed. It took me a very long time, Kishore, to be able to take the clothes of my female figures, For example, I don't call them, nude figures. For me, language is also very, very important. So it is the nakedness of the female figure that I attempted to want to create through a diagrammatic construct to address how we can remove that idea of corporeality that holds the notions of consumption. So I don't want to talk, I don't like to use
why were there these hesitations, Rekha? Why were there these hesitations when you said, when you tried to take the clothes off your figures?
It wasn't a hesitation. I had to remove the clothes of the figure. I had to be able to see that I was not replicating something simply because I did not know how to address it.
Yes.
So yes. It was something that I needed to address. It's not something that just because you understand it, you arrive at it. you understand it's a bit like making a biryani. You may like it, but you have to understand how the skills that are involved in creating something that is edible. For me, in order to be able to take these clothes off and see that my female figure did not become the object of male consumption was a process, you know. So, and hence that is the reason why I reduced its sense of what is the word, gesture, to make it very static.
Yeah.
And the word consumption is not one I'm comfortable with. We don't consume art. We find empathy and find our belonging within it. There's one last thing I would like to say, because I really delighted in what Tasneem said. I had about, you know, the way people come into the museum and the kind of different audiences you have, and that is such a truth. I had two such experiences. One was actually in Japan, which is also very conservative and very patriarchal society. And I was on a residency over there and asked by the curator of the Fukuoka Museum whether I would mind sort of working with actually in the premises of the gallery of the museum. And I said yes. And the kind of encounters I would have with the people who came to see the art and their lack of language and how they would find gestures. And the other space was when Kamini Sahani invited me to for the JNAF exhibition, which was on for 3 months at the museum in Mumbai. And I would go there for different events because I wanted to, you know, lend my time to certain projects and all. And I would watch, and I understand what Tasneem is saying is that, you know, traditions, there would be women with ghungats, you know, coming in, carrying their plastic bags, you know, and it would take my breath away to see the kind of, you know, the kind of curiosity. But I also noticed, you know, Tasneem, the sort of discomfort of some of the men, because in that sense, you know, there is, of course, there is a reversal of roles all the time in India. I mean, for me, the woman in the family is the spine. Whatever the silly man says, you know, and pretends that he has the authority, she can shut him up with her belen, chup chap say, however orthodox and however, you know, conservative she is. So she definitely, you know, understands how to subvert and how to create her power. But when you see it in these sort of other spaces, and I delight in museums where, you know, we have busloads of Indian people spilling out. I don't care for what reason they've come. Janamashtami, ye, wo, I don't care. You just go inside and they look and they're curious. But what I do notice is sometimes there is a discomfort when they are confronting things that, you know, are out of the familiar. And it is the woman who has much more of the, what is the word I'm looking for? Not panache, and she's able to sort of bridge that, because through her experiences in life, whether orthodox or otherwise, she has always to find a device by which to accommodate how to understand, even that which is not being explained, whilst men don't do that. So I loved what Tasneem said, because I completely agree. And this is the delight. And it's unfortunate that we can't invite such audiences, not because we don't try to, but galleries are such intimidating spaces, you know, and that therefore I'm always so grateful to have spaces in India, particularly like our Jahangir gallery. I don't care whether there's good art, bad art, I don't care. But just that it invites people in, some person on a date who's looking at his hair and, you know, trying to stand like his, but they're there and there is something that happens. So yes, there are all these things. And for me, it's a very complex and complicated issue. It is a huge, huge umbrella when we talk about gender, when we talk about, you know, whether we have made progress. I would say one last thing. A lot of the art that we're talking about, Kishore, comes from these streams of art education from urban, you know, so-called, you know, sanctioned good art schools, you know. So Rekha Rodwittiya came from MS University and went to art, you know, Royal College of Art. You know, so these sort of things are what we carry, and then we become the sort of representatives of art. There are many people who make the most amazing art that we don't see. And I think it's time that we understood that what we're really talking about is a certain section of people. And in that section of people, even there, there are people who come from very diverse backgrounds. And what happens, and this is because I have been an educator for so long, I can see that they try to accommodate the political correctness of how they should behave and how they should talk. And there lies a slight problem.
Can I just respond to one thing that Rekha?
Yeah, absolutely. And then I'm going to kind of just round up and go into questions. Of course.
So I just wanted to say that, Rekha, I think I'm not saying that we shouldn't art historicize. I'm an art historian. Absolutely. Everything I do is about historicizing and peeling layers away. But the point that I'm saying is, particularly with this exhibition, the focus is on the more historical aspect of gender, okay, and how artists who are in your exhibition, who are much more in the modern tradition and earlier in the modern tradition, so I was trying to say that let's move on and talk about how that dismantling of that has actually impacted where we are today. Has it impacted? Are we able to, as women, as artists, as women in the art world, has it impacted our positions? How has it changed how we approach things? I mean, certainly Rekha has given her position very, very articulately. I think it absolutely has, to take off from where what she has said, I think we need to do much more. I think, your exhibition, of course, does that, but we do need to see how and in which ways that we can impact the policy making space. For example, the museum was going to have a fashion show, and it's relevant to this, and I think all of you know what happened, because certain political parties came in and they said, you cannot have a fashion show. Museum is not the kind of space. And the reason they were objecting is they said women would be exposing their limbs. I don't know what they thought these people would be wearing, but we told them they were wearing very traditional clothes, and they would be wearing saris, in fact, in churidar kurtas. But they took all the stuff and they literally threw it out of the museum. And it was a big palaver, that whole issue. But I'm just saying, so it's very much politicized, and you're absolutely correct, Rekha, that we need to be able to break down some of these ways of seeing. And I'm not sure. I mean, it might be an interesting question to say, how do we do that? I mean, your exhibition, I think, is in an interesting way. And it should actually go into a kind of museum space, or it's something that should be addressed by an institution taking it out. The problem is that if you're in a government institution, you can't show half the works if they are nudes, or if they are, if they have any sort of revealing things, because those attitudes still pervade these institutions. So much really needs to be done to dismantle that, and that's why it tends to be looking at art or going to galleries tends to be urban, and it tends to be something that where people feel they're in an environment where they're comfortable, and they can there is definitely a class element to it. So I think those are interesting things to also talk about, the intersection of class and gender. And how do we address those within different? So as the artist, as an institution, as a collector, perhaps, but a collector who shares her collections with the public. I think we need a lot more private spaces.
Absolutely.
Because you are not constrained.
Oh, absolutely.
So that is and then you're not shackled by having to fight elections and therefore having to answer to constituencies.
Yeah, but as you mentioned, I mean, it's very interesting that both you talk about people coming into museums and looking at art in a certain way, etc. And we find that in Drishakala at the Red Fort, kind of viewership, the kind of people who come in from all walks of life, it is different from, let's say, in our galleries, which I agree with you are very intimidating spaces. Also, the fact of tribal and folk art, I think is very, very interesting. The point that gazes over there, I don't think it even comes in or is relevant to our looking at that kind of art practice, because I think this really is a construct in so many ways of the way we see pre-modern and modern art in a very structured environment. I know that we're running out of time. There are questions coming in. I have an interesting one from who's wondering whether the gaze of art also by the LGBT identity cross-culturally. I think that is something that needs to be talked about, but I don't know whether we have the time to address that on this. Take a question from Payal Singh, who's curious about whether it was a conscious decision to take only female panelists in this discussion. That is something that I can address. No, I don't think it was a conscious decision. It was the people we reached out to, and as I mentioned in her presentation, I think we are seeing that the world of art is now more seeded with women, whether they're people associated with museums, art writers, as curators, artists themselves, etc. So I think it was just happenstance, but a lovely, very lovely happenstance. I have a question from Hritam Mukherjee for Rekha, the visual of the scope of what at in this postmodern time.
See it in the chat.
Yeah, so I think what he's asking is, yeah, can you ask the questions if my voice is breaking up?
Okay.
Okay, so Rekha, it says visual pleasure is a scopophilic.
No. Okay. All right.
No, it's the one.
Yeah.
Saloni, can you just quickly tell me?
Pleasure, that's a scopophilic viewer gains from viewing Botticelli's Birth of Venus, is a dimension that the artist kept in consideration while painting it. The notion of being looked at, I refer to Laura Mulvey here, would change while historicizing the original, as current adaptations of Birth of Venus now involve the Black Venus or the queer female companions. In this postmodern time, is it even possible to historicize and, let's say, call out and cancel the gaze? Also, do you think that the hesitation of academic realist art to address the gaze of the viewer contributes to the perpetuation of a male gaze?
Oh, what a beautiful question. It's like a space for it. And thank you, Saloni. How kind of you.
Let me just add this one thing. I have a work of Venka now, which is The Death of Venus.
Yeah,
but there's no Venus present, it's just smoke. So I think it has different interpretations in different times, but yeah, continue.
No, absolutely. I think, you know, the very beautifully articulated question, and I think it becomes a space for a complete discourse. I think we have to be, as I said, and I think all of us on the panel have said this, that, you know, right now, because the conversation has been suggested to us that it is about the male and the female kind of counterpositioned in terms of what this gaze and the issue and how we're going to talk about it and how would we talk about it. We have in some ways tried to kind of accommodate the subject that Kishore wanted to talk to us about in relation to an exhibition that DAG is already having. But I think that, you know, I, again, I'm going to sort of say very emphatically that it is also very culture specific. You cannot, you know, for example, I mean, the kind of, and I don't want to make this into a political discourse, but we have to be very clear about the realities we live in. The India that I grew up in, when in the 70s, because as I said, I'm 62 years old, was such a kind of liberal, and, you know, I used to wear halter necks and walk around in, you know, hot pants and play hockey, and, you know, there was no big issue. Was it that the factor of sexism wasn't prevalent. It was, but there was a simpler, kind of country that we were living in, where the ideals, the sort of Nehruvian ideals, were still trying to sort of find itself, to be cultivated. This sort of pluralistic space. The idea that it was an inclusive society. Today, it is not that, and I think that the kind of overriding patriarchy we see comes from the kind of politics that we have, without overspelling it, because this may not be the forum for it. And therefore, the kind of environment that we live in obliges us to not forget. Take, for example, that somebody will take out a gun and shoot you. It's not so long ago, that Jessica Lal was shot because she didn't, give a drink. I'm giving sort of examples of that are well known. But then in every society, in every culture, in every geography, there will be the specificity of how we see things. Again, I want to say that I don't want to look at art as a sort of separation. Art becomes something that is fleshed out and sort of articulated from why and how we see things, and why and how we create that intervention. I forget this Japanese artist, because I'm so bad with names, who has taken these wonderful photographs of, gay men dressed up as, sort of this reclining odalisque. And this was in the 90s, You have, you talked about, Saloni talked about this wonderful artist we have, Pushpa Malas, and the avatars that, she takes on. That why is she dressing up in that thing? Is to actually question, whether it's colonialism, whether it is, feudalism, whether it's patriarchy. So definitely today, the trampoline of how we stand to address gender is not just male and female. It's not just the feminist and the patriarchal position. Of course, it is the LGBT community and all the other things that continuously are unfolding. And in fact, these need to be addressed as important and relevant things. But within all of that, you will find, and I'm interested in India. Call me stupid, I don't mind. But I am interested in how the Indian artist, the Indian audience, am I saying that we don't place ourselves in an international space? Of course we do. But I'm talking about what we converse about comes from where we geographically are located, the culture, the social space, the economics, and these things are going to influence us. So should there be a black woman? All of that is something that, may or may not be relevant to one person and may be relevant to another person. But art, people making art must address this. People who are using art, museum spaces, listen, look at the NGMA. Look, I completely agree with Tasneem. Look at the NGMA. What a skewered collection they have. Completely male, completely, sort of crony collection. These are national institutions. We need to really understand that what is the national position. Therefore, we do need private intervention. So if you look at a KNMA, it's a marvelous, you look at a DAG, it's a marvelous intervention, because DAG often acts like a museum. So I don't know if I've answered the question, but I don't really want to get into things in such a specific, whether this art or that art. It's a complex space of how we view gender. And we need to address it because it is the representation of identity. Gender is a representation of identity. Let's not be coy about it.
Of course it is. I'm sorry I missed a lot of what you were saying, Rekha, because of the terrible connection at my end, but it seems to have kind of picked up once again. There have been a very large number of questions that have been coming in, which we obviously can't take anymore. But in terms of the representation of artists, and art itself being associated with popular culture, I'd just like to have Tasneem respond to that one kind of query that I have, Tasneem. How much of popular culture is reflected in art and art in popular culture in terms of the kind of discourse that we're seeing around women in any manner at all?
So that wasn't clear. So how
Tasneem,
much of women are in popular culture? I'm not clear.
No, how much of art is in popular culture and the other way around?
How much art there is
need
in
to
popular
unmute.
culture. So we're getting into another binary now. This is not a binary that I'm very comfortable with.
Is that something that you'd like to respond to, Saloni, while we wait for Tasneem?
No, I can respond to it, absolutely. So when you say art, what do you mean by art? Are you talking, is it just the sort of a 19th century, early 20th century view of what is fine art, high art? See, I think we're in a completely postmodern, post-truth, whatever they say, world where art is, it has so many different registers. And they're all equally valid because they are representative of the human voice, of human feelings. And to say that, oh, this is very fine and this isn't, of course, there are levels of skill involved, etc. So when in fact, when we were curating Connecting Threads, this was something that we were looking at as well. The idea of process, of skill. Art is about so many more things than just a kind of delectation of something that is very beautiful hanging on the wall. You know, it is, it goes into, it's, so this idea of that this is popular culture and this is fine art, you know, I kind of, I'm very uncomfortable with those kinds of, creating those kinds of silos. I mean, they may be handles through which one can academically deconstruct certain things, but in terms of the way an audience responds, they respond equally to those wonderful dioramas that we have and the models we have, which would be called popular culture, and I guess in a certain way, the company school painting. And at the same time, they also respond to some of the, you know, very fine paintings, etc., that we have, Durandar, etc. So it's, I mean, I don't know whether there is art, and there's absolutely art in popular culture, very much so.
Thank you. You know, it's really been my loss this evening.
Just say one thing.
Yeah, of course, Saloni, go right ahead.
Oh God, again.
Go right ahead, Saloni.
No, I mean, when I think of popular culture in today's times, I think of Bollywood, and I'm not a consumer of Bollywood. So, but I would still say that I do know that people, I mean, you know, the female voyeurism, because today, I mean, a Shah Rukh or a Hrithik or a Salman are paid to take off their shirts. So what I mean is, like, we may not have it in fine art, we may have, you know, the voyeuristic gaze in other forms of art, which we may not be aware of living in, you know, the world that we live in, and, you know, talking in these, you know, in light of this show. But I just feel that the reverse and art in popular culture exists, but in a very different way, and it different from, you know, the world that we are in. That's all.
Thanks, Saloni. What I was beginning to say was that it really has been my loss. I've missed so many of your responses and the kind of discussion that was happening. So I'm going to have to really say sorry that, you know, I haven't been able to knit it as well as I had hoped to at the start of this conversation. But thank you, all of you, Tasneem, Rekha, Saloni, for being a part of this panel. I'm going to ask the audience to, of course, online viewing room at DAG World to try and catch a glimpse of the exhibition, to see what it is that we were actually trying to create a conversation around. I think these conversations are extremely important for us. As Rekha points out, in a country like ours, we definitely need to take this within a certain political structure, not as isolated works and examples of art itself. It needs to be a part of popular discourse as well, and it should cut through all kinds of cultural practices. Thank you all once again, Tasneem, Rekha, Saloni. And thank you to the audience.
Thank you, Kishore.
Thank you.